Jim and Jean, welcome to our conversation this morning. It's a pleasure to have you both here. I'd love to start the conversation by just maybe telling us, Jim, how you and Jean met and became friends.
Well, we met through our wives. Our wives met first. I can't remember how. Wait, I do remember how. They both used the same person who did their hair, and and um, the person who did Barbara's hair, whose name is Sherry, and also did Jean's wife's Mary's hair. Um, mentioned their doctor, Mary Donovan, Jean's wife, and Barbara was looking for a doctor, and I think they became friends in that way. And Mary mentioned to her husband Jean that I played tennis, and we got together and we decided to try each other out on the tennis court. And during the interstitial moments, we engaged in conversation about all kinds of things. And I believe that's how we became friends. Our wives continued to be friends, but I think we had a stronger attachment.
Mhm. Jean, is that how you remember the beginning of the friendship?
Uh, yeah, the answer is yes. And then there were other facets of it. Our kids were in a common preschool called Log Cabin that was on the campus of Hampden-Sydney. And our children, well, my oldest daughter is very close in age to Ruthie, just a year behind. And they became friends quickly and have stayed friends. Still now best of friends, talk on every week or every 2 weeks, and visit one another also. So, but yes, I remember that. The friendship has been very interesting, and it has kind of, as far as I can tell, it's still changing, still morphing into something, and it's grown in various ways, which are unique to my friendship with Jim. Yes, I do remember that from the beginning.
I want to add something to the friendship of our daughters. I had gotten an infection on my foot, and I called Mary Donovan, Jean's wife, and she took a look at it and said she wanted to do a biopsy. And she was home. It was a weekend, and so I was taking care of Ruthie. I don't know where Barbara was, and I mean she was certainly in a good place, but she wasn't at home, and and Mary took her daughter, and we went to the medical office in Burkeville so she could do the biopsy. And our daughters were sitting in the back seat, and they were talking about books. They were only 7 or so, but they were discussing all the books that they had read and they had read in common. And it was just a most wonderful conversation to be eavesdropping on from the front seat. And they established, I believe, even at that young age, a kind of intellectual friendship that had as its center the books that they were reading. Right?
Well, the topic for today's conversation is sort of parenthood. So maybe I'll start with asking you, how has your both being parents and raising children together sort of impacted the friendship? How do you think that has affected how you became friends over time?
Well, I can say first that Jean and Mary have been really have set an example for so many people in the world. I only wish that people would follow it. They both were part of the same medical practice, but they both worked only part of the week so that they could be at home while raising the children before they went to school. And they each of them worked only 2 days, and I think they had a common day maybe in the middle. I might be mistaken about what day it was, but on that day, they were both together, and even when the kids were in school, they would take trips and do things together on that day. And that way, neither of them got burned out from the job, but also there was always somebody at home to take care of the children. And they knew that in doing that, that they were giving up a bigger income if both of them worked. But it was, I thought, brilliant and wonderful parenting. They set a model that I wish others would follow, who put more stock in bringing up their children than in making sure that they lived in a super luxurious house.
Can your thoughts on, as we start the conversation, on the impact of sort of parenthood on the friendship?
Well, we talked a lot about our children, and I think we tried to help them whenever we could. I knew the daughter of Jean, who was Ruthie's friend, best of the three daughters, and but it was fun to watch them grow up, all three of them, and I know that when Ruthie became a teenager, she worked at the Burkeville Clinic and did administrative chores, and Mary took care of all two of our children as they were growing up. She was a wonderful doctor who included in her practice pediatric medicine.
Jean, maybe I'll ask the same question to you as you reflect back on how the fact that you're both raising children at almost the same time impacted the friendship.
Well, it certainly it brought the friendship closer to have something shared like that. The other thing is that for me, for parenting, I tend to look at examples, I guess, as Jim was saying, of people around me, and I actually tend to exclude from friendship, at least from close friendships, people that I don't admire, people that I think are set to cause problems in the family. I would see that in physician families in town, and indeed many of those parents ended up getting divorced. So I tended to hang out and spend my free time, other than my Wednesday off with Mary, with people that I could look at and see that they're doing a good job, and then take pieces of it and put it into parenting skills. Of course, my parents were the first one, but from the standpoint of Jim, for example, as I go back to my original thing, I like being around people that I admire, and they do tend to bring out the best in me, whether that's my wife or whether it's a friend or my brothers or whomever. And Jim tends to do that. He's very, as you know, he's very thoughtful, kind of, and reflects on things in a charitable and kind way that I think is worth emulating. And so it's good to be around because it improves my pattern of thought and thinking, and my relationship with my wife. And then as we've talked about things over the years, even though our children are, Ruthie's my oldest daughter's age, and then Sam's a couple years older. And I think Sam went to the junior or senior prom with my daughter Jane, if I recall.
Yes.
That's right, because he didn't have a date, and so so they were a little ahead of us, and we could kind of watch and see the things they did, and I admired the way their children remained affectionate, and the time and the way they invested themselves into their children, and very successfully, all while giving them freedom to make the mistake to go to West Point or yeah. So anyway, so that's how the friendship has impacted my parenting.
Jane, people are often asked to reflect after they've raised children. What have you learned about parenting, or do you have a parenting philosophy? I'll ask that question to you as you reflect back on this experience, and you said, and the influence that Jim had. Could you say I can articulate my own view of what parenthood is or what it should be?
Well, the second most important thing you do, first is your relationship with your wife, and the second one is the relationship with the kids. But I also learned that from my mom and dad. I think we've been, as with Jim, I think we've been very successful in raising our kids. They're all well launched. They're all very close together. They love spending time with each other and with us. And all my brothers did that. Each of my brothers, as with myself and Mary, each of my brothers also in some way put aside a bigger income to spend more time with their kids. My next oldest brother, whom I talk with Jim a lot about, who I go camping with, put aside a very successful Northern Virginia law practice to go work in upstate New York for the state at a lower income because he realized that he was not having the time with his children that he wanted. And then that let his wife, who was a lawyer, take a part-time job with the state also. And each of my brothers did that. Somehow we got that. My parents didn't. They were very traditional. Dad worked full-time. Mom was a stay-at-home mom, but we kind of valued the things that I see Jim and Barb value, which is not the lucrative income of a classics professor at, I don't know, Penn State or someplace like that. Instead, settled into the quieter but very productive life at Hampden-Sydney College. And so it's it would be, finding imaginative ways to spend time with your children, to focus on them, to make sure that they're encouraged in their relationship, and recognize, as each of us did, you got 18 years to do it as far as that part goes, and then you have the rest of the time, hopefully, to then give additional advice and encouragement, but not with the same level of authority as you had before.
Jim, maybe pose the same question to you as you reflect back on.
Well, I think I brought it up earlier. I think that the devaluation in a materialistic society of money is a big example from the Donovans and from his brother. I've often said that we classics professors don't make much gold, but that it shines with a greater luster. And I think that would extend also to the career of these physicians. Their pile wasn't as big, but it was brighter and more radiant than normal gold. I want to say that I've learned a lot from Gene too, and I wanted to give an example, even though it may not relate to parenting, but we've often discussed medical issues and academic issues and the correspondences between them. And I've often gone to Gene with some questions about classical texts. And generally, the questions, or very often the questions had to do with medicine. So for example, there's some characters who die of diseases that have never been identified. And these are some villains like Sulla, who was a kind of predecessor and forerunner of Julius Caesar as an autocrat. And he died a horrible, painful disease death, and nobody knows exactly what he had. So I went to Gene and described the symptoms. And I said, well, Gene, you can tell me what he had. And he would often try to guess or try to figure it out from the symptoms that I described. And I'm getting the symptoms from the ancient historians. And I said to Gene, in jest, as I frequently do, well, you don't have to worry. If you misdiagnose them, they can sue you for malpractice. And he responded, yeah, but then I can't also send them a bill for an office visit. Right? And I thought that was an exceedingly witty response and a good one. And I've remembered that all the time. And I think that's one of the features of our friendship that causes both our children to groan is that we like to joke. And one of our favorite forms of humor is the pun. And so we've shared this experience of having our offspring groan at our humor. But I think it's something that one, there's a Roman poet, Horace, one of my favorite poets, who says that a life without jokes is a life without pleasure and without love.
So Jim, let me go back then to the question about the philosophy of parenting. Maybe you would
Yeah,
think that humor is a part of that, is a critical element of that
it
philosophy.
is. You need to share mirth with your children.
And then to a new parent, you think about your experience, you'd say, do you have a viewpoint? To a new parent, if they ask you, what's your approach to parenting? What's your philosophy of how to be a good parent? How would you
Well,
answer that question?
I would say that the very first thing that you do with your child is in the hospital when you give it the name, and you need to give it a name that's meaningful, not a name that just sounds good because you like the noise, but a name that is either of somebody important in your own life, or somebody who is a good person who uh, who the child can be proud to have that name. And so I would give that is the advice when you're even filling out the birth certificate. So you don't want to name your kid Attila, as in Attila the Hun. That name should be retired. Or you don't want to name your son Cain, the first murderer. So that's what I would say.
Let's assume we complete that part successfully. What happened? Anything beyond that?
He didn't name any of his daughters Jezebel.
Or is that set? Once the name is there, you're pretty much done.
No. But the beginning is important. The beginning is more than half, as Solon used to say.
Right. You're in Tristan Shandy's father.
But it does more than that, because it shows you've thought about it, and that you've not just picked the pleasure principle of what sounds nice to the ears, but you've given it a thoughtful, you thought about it, and that's already a sign of being a good parent.
Okay, and then
I mean, the second.
Yes, if that's the first piece of advice.
Well, you can't do much other than
Tristan Shandy's father would have been very good friends.
But you can't do much else that's human, before logos and reason kick in, and otherwise you're doing what all parents do. You keep them clean and you feed them and warm and so on. But once they learn to speak, I think that what Jean alluded to, that you want to attend to their moral education, is really true. So right off from the bat, you should start reading to them, and reading books that are not going to be about different ways to kill your brother, but books which are life affirming and teach goodness to the children in every form of goodness.
And then is there any difference between doing that with someone who is not your child and someone who is? If at that point the logos is what becomes most paramount, and there's a formation that you give as a parent to someone, what makes it different?
The parents also model good behavior all the time. That's a critical difference, and that's the first step in the education. When the children are very little, even before they can speak, they can see how you react to crises, whether you do it in an explosive way or with calmness, how you treat your spouse, whether it's with affection, whether you lose your temper, things like this. But I think that you always, good people tend to have good children, because they don't have explosive tempers or respond with violence or things like that. And I think the children pick that up. But I was thinking about the moral education, not by example, but by the more active education, because just not being short-tempered or mean-spirited is something that you're not doing consciously. It's just part of your nature.
But again, you model for students. I guess I'm trying to find, is there a thing that you do because they're a child that you don't do with a student because you?
Yeah, we bathe them.
Okay, that's little, the only thing.
We bathe them. Otherwise, I think that being a parent, being a teacher is almost the same thing as being a parent. You just don't see them as often and you don't bathe them. I don't know what you had in mind.
Okay. So other than bathing, then parenting is the same as teaching. Gina,
Well, and taking them to the doctor and doing other things that one does for one's kids. What did you have something particular in mind? I teach the same kind of things to my children as I do as I my children are now grown. My son will be 40 this month, and my daughter is 38. But when they were at home, I didn't teach them anything that I wouldn't teach my students, and vice versa. I never used bad language, swear words, or either obscenities or profanities, and I don't think they used them probably until they got to high school or learned them someplace else and were subjected to peer pressure.
Gene, your thoughts on parenting versus teaching,
Yeah, well,
or the role of teaching in parenting, maybe?
well, and actually that, of course, is one of the issues that comes up now with public schools, is public schools are expected to take over, teaching more ethics or morals or certain ideas that, anyway, and not all of them are good, but to me, I guess the qualitative difference is, I haven't taught in the same way Jim has, and when I did teach, it was medical students or residents, so it tended to be much more factual information, although there are the habits of a good physician as far as being compassionate and caring and things like that. But from a parent standpoint, as opposed to reading to a nephew or a niece, for example, I would, have the whole approach of how basically I want our kids to turn out. And we would focus everything on that. But I wouldn't carry that level of expectation or hope or authority or whatever to children that I was not directly responsible for. I still would be kind. I still wouldn't swear. I still wouldn't get mad. I still would be patient, and I probably would still read the same books. But from my standpoint, the outcome from Mary's and my standpoint, our outcome was focused in a very specific way. For us, it was for the kids to remain Christian and have their Christianity mature through college and then into their adult life. And they've all been successful in making that leap, each step of the way. So things that we did were very much focused for that. Whether it was limiting television, which was almost non-existent in our household, and I think in Jim's too, as far as I can tell, or whether it was the kids voluntarily making decisions to limit their friendships as the kids kind of went astray as they got into their teen years. Each of my daughters, two oldest daughters, had to completely change their friends in their early high school years because other kids started hanging out with the Hampden-Sydney boys or or things like that. So yeah, the answer is my focus is different just because I think of them as basically part of myself. Our family is a unit, just as much as Mary and myself are a unit as defined by the marriage. And that relationship doesn't exist with anybody else.
I think Carlos should have asked you a question parallel to mine. How did you treat your children differently from your patients? He's a physician. I had students, but he
Sure.
had
Yeah.
patients.
Yeah.
Well, it's clear you
I was-
attended to their physical. I would say you attended mostly, virtually entirely to your patients' physical health, and with your children, you were attending to every kind of health, physical and psychological.
Well, actually, for my patients, we very much had a moral dimension to our patients. So I can remember very vividly talking with a guy who was a decade or so younger than I am some time ago, and as we conversed, I encouraged him to talk to his son about how he was doing and where is he sexually and things like that. And the guy came back to me and said, wow, I'm so glad you told me that. I wish I had done it a little earlier. His girlfriend is pregnant and they're not married, and that's causing great distress. But it improved that guy's relationship with his son. It was a step. And we tended to do that. We tended to look at patients as part of a family unit. We made house calls. We went to church meetings, went to funerals, weddings, things like that. So in that sense, we treated our patients as we would very good friends, basically, with some instruction where it was needed.
I think, Carlos, that this is a chance to for us to discuss something that Jean and I discussed, which are the parallels between having students and having patients. Was that on your list?
It absolutely is. And
Oh,
so I go right ahead if there was something you wanted to discuss, please.
well, I remember it from the very beginning when we were playing tennis. This is 30 something years ago. Just as students, one of their hobbies is to complain about their teachers. So teachers like to talk about their students, and doctors about their patients. And we discovered so many parallels, and they were, and the longer we talked over the decades, we found hundreds of them. Doctor really wants health for his patients, and a teacher wants his students to learn. And for a student to learn, he has to do his homework. For a patient to improve, he has to follow the doctor's orders and take his medicine and not skip a day or two. And he has to understand the instructions well. So maybe you could ask some questions about that.
I also wanted to ask about something you just brought up, Jean, and that was religion.
Mm-hmm. Which I think is a good topic because both of us share that.
I know that both of you, faith plays a role in both of your lives. How does Christianity inform your view of parenthood?
Well, let's see. In the Catholic view, of course, when the man and woman are married, they're one flesh, but the family is seen as a symbol of the Trinity. So and that's the Trinity is such an intimate unit of Godhead, but the family is supposed to be seen as that intimate, that important, and that again, that important. So we tended to look. We tended to be very conscious, as Jim is with his students, about how do we help our children be virtuous. And I don't mean just virginal, I mean virtuous in the sense of growing in the classical virtues, as well as to have a good, strong moral basis for their life that would let them be happier people, that would increase their dignity. So we did little things. There was a Christian psychologist that was very popular in the 80s when our kids were growing up, and we used his material to try to figure out age-appropriate times, age-appropriate topics for talking with the kids, the obvious ones you can think of. And what we did is when the kids got to be 11 or 12, my wife would take each of the kids away for a weekend every year, usually in the fall, and then they would talk about one or two topics from a Christian standpoint about, whether it was purity or whether it was friendship or whether it was relationship with parents or whatnot, and they would go to a mall on the Chesterfield Town Center on this end of Richmond. They'd stay in a motel for 2 nights. They'd shop. They'd go out to eat. Then they'd go back to the motel and they'd talk about these subjects, and they talk about them as they wandered around the mall. Then they go to mass on Sunday morning and then drive back home. And the kids loved it. I mean, it was very useful. And the other thing you could do is you could repeat topics, unlike stopping all drugs in school, which they teach you at age 12 and never mention it again, you could mention it initially and then build on the topic year by year as the issue became more important, like sexual activity by the time my kids were old, by the time they were 16, 17, things like that. So, so we, that's, so we use a Christian focus from that standpoint, since that's where we see the authority from.
But would you say there's a thing that Christianity brings to parenthood, which is unique to Christianity, or perhaps more enhanced because you are a Christian parent?
Well, since so you get married in the Christian view, and especially in the Catholic view, which is the one I'm most familiar with, since I'm a cradle Catholic. But I know a lot of non-Catholic Christians around here. The Catholic Church understands that at certain times in life, you receive graces or blessings from God, basically, that enable you to carry out your responsibilities. So marriage is one, baptism is another, and then the reception of sacraments. And so those times of grace, along with the ordinary part of life where you're living a good life, those do give some ability to withstand some of the issues going on, some of the vagaries of life, some of the pressures of life. So yeah, there's a real help there, and a real, and then the other thing from us practically is understanding that, we would never divorce. It was just never an option. So we just never thought about it, and the kids would always be a part of the family, whether, they ended up the way we wanted to or not. So there would always be, they would always be a part of us, basically.
Jim, let me ask the same question to you. A different faith, but how has Judaism, your tradition, informed parenthood?
Well, it also starts with the name, which I've already talked about. As soon as the kids grow, our kids grew up in a house where we celebrated the Sabbath every week, and the principal holidays. We sent them to Hebrew school at an early age. The word for school in Hebrew is Beit HaSefer, which means the house of the book. And Judaism is focused on the Torah and on the commentaries. We discussed those kinds of issues at home, and all issues in what is a Talmudic way, which is to argue. And the Talmud is really the most important book in Judaism, except for the Torah, which are the 5 books of Moses. And the Talmud consists of arguments between or among rabbis, and they argue with great enthusiasm on different issues, taking different sides. And there's no voice that comes out and says Rabbi Hillel has the correct answer or Rabbi Shammai. You're left with just the argument. And I think my wife and I argued all the time about this or that. And I also have such arguments with Jean over this and that as we're walking or even playing tennis. And that was part of the modeling. I myself did something analogous to what Mary did with the children, but in a different way altogether. But for each child, when Samuel was 12 and when Ruthie was 16, but separately in 1992 and then again in 1998. In 1992, I had a sabbatical, and I took Samuel with me for two and a half months to Turkey and Greece. We went all by ourselves. I was our intention was to go to all the sites that Herodotus mentions that are in those areas. I was working on a book on Herodotus at the time, but we spent all our days together and we went here and there. And that was a time for us to talk with one another. And it was, my entire focus was on him. And I was the only person, other than the people who were living in those countries. And that was a big part of his education. And I did the same with Ruthie in 1998, though at that time we went to England, Italy, and North Africa. I was working on a book on science and religion at the time. That was for the North Africa because I was interested in Islamic science, particularly in the Middle Ages. And that was a key event, I think, in her youth, and it had a big effect on her. I had to teach her the material that she would have had in high school for the month that she had to lose because her month overlapped with the summer. Samuel's, he lost 2 months of school in which he had to have the lessons, but it didn't hurt. That absence from school didn't hurt either of them. Samuel was valedictorian of his class in high school, and Ruthie was only number 3 or 4 in her high school class, and they both been really good students. So that was something analogous to taking each girl away by herself every year. So I think that. And that was not in particular a Jewish thing to do, but it was something analogous, and that's why I brought it up. Something analogous to what Mary did with the daughters, with the girls.
Let me follow up with a little different topic. You're both accomplished in your fields and have achieved success in professions which are considered to be extraordinary professions. To be a scholar, to be a physician is not an ordinary achievement. How do you think that affected your children as they maybe thought this is the standard that I need to achieve or a goal that I need to meet? Do you think it ever, or how did you deal with that and setting the right expectation for them as children of people who are accomplished in their field?
Well, I don't know, Gene, do you want to go first, or
Sure, I can. I always wait for you to go first, though, Jim, because I like listening to you.
I'll let you start, please.
That's because I'm older.
Jim's kids may not have had the same pressures that came mostly from the school kids, because school kids thought that since they could look at Mary and me and see we're 2 physicians, first of all, everybody thought we were super rich. And why did we drive these crummy cars? But they also just assumed that the kids would be super smart, and they're smart, and that they would succeed. And it was made a little more intense because my oldest daughter she was also the valedictorian, and she was really a shining star in English and some other composition and some other things too.
Latin, don't forget Latin.
Latin, that's right. And that created pressure on the 2 younger ones to, oh good, here's another Donovan girl. I'm sure she'll do just as well. And Anne ended up being, I think, 3rd in the class. She didn't want to do any more than that. So we didn't. We never, our idea was to never, in the context of spending more time with the kids, we actually never pushed our kids for sports. They all did some sports, cross country, at the invitation of the history coach or history teacher, I think it was, and maybe soccer, but they never really got into it just beyond what was going on in the high school. They didn't go to travel teams or anything like that. And we didn't really push them to excel, although we attended all the games and practiced a little bit in the backyard. And we didn't, other than giving them a reward for a good report card, which would usually be going to Dairy Queen and getting one of those thick shakes that you can put Oreo cookies in. We actually didn't, if they brought home a poor report, we just simply would not too obviously sit down and work with their homework with them for the next grading session. But we didn't really push them to, we kept them out of the governor's school because we thought that would take away from their time with friends, and we made sure that summers were kept as a family thing so that we could all hang out together again, rather than doing sports all the way through the summer. So we tried not to push the kids to perform. We knew they would, and we could watch them and look at their report cards, but we never made it a big topic. We kind of did it a little bit secretly, and then just did the little rewards from. Actually, even if it wasn't that good of a report card, they'd still get a reward.
So Jim, same question to you. Your father, extremely distinguished, growing up in his footsteps, and your own children following in that legacy. How did you manage that?
Well, unfortunately, my father died in 1981 when Samuel was only a few months old. So they didn't grow up with, and my mother had died 3 years before he was born. So they grew up without grandparents on my side. I don't think we ever did anything to pressure them to study. They just did it naturally. They grew up as I did. My mother was a biochemist, and my father was a psychiatrist, and we always had interesting conversations and arguments over the dinner table. And I grew up in an intellectual atmosphere, and all my parents' friends were similar. I had two uncles on my mother's side, and one was a chemist and the other an engineer. I mean, everybody was educated, and it just, and also I grew up in Upper West Side in Manhattan, and there were no sports facilities. I grew up completely sportsless. My father, who had grown up in Italy, was completely uninterested in sports, as was my mother, though she danced. She took ballet dancing when I was a child. So we didn't, and then naturally, having grown up in Manhattan and having played in the streets without any formal sports, my elementary school didn't have any sports. When I went to summer camp or high school, I didn't know how to do anything. And so I was never picked, and that reinforced a disinterest in, lack of interest in sports. And I imagine that I communicated that somewhat. Barbara, who, however, was an exceedingly good athlete in high school, and she was in the first Title IX class. She graduated high school in 1972, and that's when Title IX went into effect. So when she got to college, they had to have girls' teams or women's teams, and she was on the basketball team in college, and she had played field hockey. And when our children were little, she desperately wanted them to play Pee Wee League and baseball. And so we tried, and the only thing they liked about it was, our kids liked about it was putting on the uniform. And they would sit in the grass because they had to play super outfield and look at the daisies. And unfortunately, both our children inherited from my side the non-sports gene, if there is such a gene, or they didn't develop. There probably isn't such a gene, but they didn't develop this. They didn't have the sports gene. A non-sports gene probably doesn't exist because you couldn't have a negative gene. But they didn't have the sports gene, and I taught them how to read, both of them, at a very early age. I think I taught Samuel when he was 4, and Ruthie when Barbara said I would never be able to teach Ruthie because she was, more energetic. But I taught her at an even earlier age, and she was reading Mr. Popper's Penguins, which is a book, not even a reader, after a couple of months. And so they always read. And it is true what Jean said. They didn't watch TV, maybe a half hour a day, and they had to go to bed early. Let's say, I think when they were little, 7:30, but they could stay up till 8 o'clock if they would spend the last half hour reading. So they thought they were, getting to stay up late, and it also encouraged them to read. So when they went to school, they did well. I remember the first day that Samuel came back from kindergarten, which was the public school, and he was about to tell us. He looked around and he was going to tell us which girl he was thinking of marrying. He couldn't make up his mind whether it would be this one or that one. And I remember saying to him that he didn't have to decide such an important issue, at least until he was in the second grade. But he was already doing that. But I did notice too, when he came back from school, he started making grammatical errors in his. I taught freshman composition as you know, at Hampden-Sydney. You had me for that class, and we're supposed to teach formal English. And so I tried also to speak formal English, which uses the nominative case for this is he, and Barbara would one day ask, Barbara would ask, who would like another piece of cake? And I would say, I would. And Samuel would say, I too, instead of me too, but when he went to kindergarten, he started saying me too instead of I too, but so that's an example.
That's
Sorry,
because I grew up in the opposite circumstance. I was the first generation to go to college in my family, and so my dad was a blue collar worker through most of our lives, and then moved up into middle management at a small printing company in our hometown. And my mom stayed at home until all the kids went to college, and then she got a job as a secretary at Binghamton University. So we actually, other than the reading I did on my own and saw it on my own with the help of my oldest brother, we were not that big. We weren't big readers in my family as a rule, except comic books. And we also didn't, the conversation with 6 boys and 2 parents at the table didn't tend to be too intellectual. It tended to be loud, but not too intellectual. But what my parents did do that helped. So my parents didn't really watch over our studies very much. I guess they just figured we went to Catholic schools, parochial schools, so the nuns tended to kind of watch over that. But what my parents did do is we would go away every summer, move 4 miles out of town to the old family farm on top of a hill, and spend June, July, and August, half of June, July, and August, clumped together as a Donovan enclave, along with the Wilcox enclave, which really, of course, intensified the family feeling and the family relationship. And played a lot of games, no television, played a lot of games, hiked all day, but didn't do sports. I did some basketball and then wrestled in high school, but once I finished the basketball. But but there was that time together as a family. And I think out of that kind of grew our decision, and my brothers had done this also, to not have the kids be very intense in sports. Sacrificing what they could have done for another goal, which was to keep the family intact, keep the family as a unit, grow together that way. But out of that, somehow I learned to study. It took some time. Actually, didn't do well my first semester in high school or college, college, and the first month in med school. Then after I got the hang of studying at the next level, then things went extremely well. But I really found it on my own. And my kids all were successful at their studies too.
Gene, we're almost out of time, so I'll close with one final question, and that is, as you talk to your own children about becoming parents, what advice do you give or have given to them?
Well, we both have children who are parents. Yeah.
That's right.
We're both grandparents. You're not going to ask any grandparent questions.
No, I'll just close with advice to your children that you gave when they became parents.
Boy, starts with the spouse, with them choose. That's, to me, is always the big breath holder of choosing the proper spouse. And things got a little close a time or two with our middle daughter, and we tried to gently steer her away from those we thought would just be a real disastrous influence for her. And that turned out to be extraordinarily successful for both of the kids. My oldest daughter's unmarried. When they, as they started raising the kids, I think basically when my middle daughter was taking classes at the church she was at, marriage formation classes, it was a very intense experience, very long. They had to shadow an older couple, and I think out of that, she realized a bunch of things that Mary and I had done deliberately, like the times away, the careful attention to how the kids are being raised, the two of us staying closer together. And I know Jim says he argues with Barbara, but I think it's probably more discusses with Barbara rather than argue.
I was using the word argue in the philosophical sense.
Right, yeah. And so our kids heard us discuss, but very lightly. So I think actually practically out of those lessons, both girls saw things that we had brought to the table, and then they would ask us some things. It's nice to be a doctor because it kind of still gives some authority to the things you say to your kids about your grandkids. Seriously, I mean, it really does. So that kind of helps us to stay more involved in their lives in a lot of ways.
Jim, same question to you to close our conversation. Advice to your children about being a parent.
Well, I was warned by a number of friends of mine who had children and then grandchildren not to repeat the errors that they had made as in talking to their children about how to bring up their grandchildren. And the uniform advice was don't give advice, because if you do, the children will resent it, and absolutely don't try to discipline the grandchildren. Leave it to the parents. And I have religiously followed that advice. I think, though, that whatever lessons, for the most part, whatever lessons you can give to them, you have given to them while they were growing up by the example that you set. If you were good parents, then your children will probably try to model or will imitate the kind of parent and the kind of things that you did. There's you're both familiar with the commandment in Genesis to honor your fathers, and then the part that says the sins of the parents, the sins of the fathers are visited upon their children into the third generation. Well, my interpretation of that line is not that, let's say I rob a bank, then the ignominy for bank robbery will fall into my children and my grandchildren and their children. But what it means is the sins of the fathers, which means parents, it's the same, fathers includes mothers. The sins of the parents are visited upon their children means that if you are if you're a terrible parent, if you're a bad parent, then your children will learn that as the way to be a parent, and their children will suffer. And it takes 3 generations to wipe out the bad parenting. And that's what that's my interpretation of the line. It doesn't just go on, if I rob a bank, that's sin, because there's no connection between my robbing a bank and the lives of my grandchildren. But if I'm a terrible father, let's say I beat my children and my wife, and my children grow up seeing that, that's how we know how child abuse runs in families, or wife abuse, or other kinds of bad characteristics. And I think that's the meaning of that commandment.
If I may, just one quick thing. I had an advantage that Jim didn't have, which is my parents both lived into their 90s. So I actually got to watch them be grandparents. Not only did I watch them be parents, and I learned a lot, but then when it came time to be a grandparent, I could easily think back to what I could watch my parents evolve by biting their tongue about a daughter-in-law, by not disciplining the grandkids, and watch the way my mom especially would encourage the grandkids into good behavior or into certain habits. And both Mary and I got to watch that. So, and that was just really priceless for us to have seen, and to have seen it been so hugely successful. So
if they were going to do a revised version of the Torah, it would say, and the virtues of the grandparents are carried forward into the 5th generation. So it would include the grandchildren's grandchildren.
Yeah. On that positive note, we'll close our conversation. But before we do, Gene, any final thoughts about the experience of reflecting on this topic with Jim?
Well, again, from my standpoint, the consistent note really throughout most of my life, certainly my late teen years up, is to take example from other people and to bring around you people, look for those people and let them be an influential part of your life. I still take encouragement from Jim. We spend a lot of time together, the weekly walks, hikes twice a year, dinners before the COVID stuff. And so he's been more important, and he's getting to be even more important. I think the friendship continues to grow and plays a role in me being a we talk about our grandkids because they're very close in age. I've got more than he does, but anyway, we won't be competitive about that. So for me, that's what
sports as much as you.
Yeah. So in all aspects of parenting, marriage, grandparenting, I tend to look at examples around me, as well as read, but look at examples around me and draw good lessons from people I know and admire, and then hang out with them, basically, it's kind of, and keep in touch with them.
Jim, any final thoughts before we sign off?
Well, the relationship of parents and children has always been sometimes fraught. And that's why the humor novels by P.G. Wodehouse always have an uncle instead of parent. You hardly ever see relations of the children with their parents, but the good relations are with their uncle. And I think that the best thing that you can try to be is both a father or a parent and an uncle or an aunt also to your children. So you have you're just not an authority figure, but you're also a figure of mirth, of good cheer. So that's my concluding comment.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you to both for your time today, and we'll sign off from the recording.
Sounds good. Thank you, guys.